Welcome. In this episode, we will examine some of the key people of the Italian Renaissance, as well as explore the key characteristics of one of the most famous aspects of the Italian Renaissance, its art, which is where we'll begin. I'll run through this quickly as a comparison between some Renaissance and more medieval forms of art. So first, a few examples of medieval art. Notice some of the themes, some of the characteristics, some of the uh, by our standards today, less sophisticated elements of scale and perspective and design, much more two-dimensional. As the Renaissance goes on, a little more detailed. But if we were in class, we might walk through some of these themes and styles and techniques together. An example of Renaissance art, you notice the extreme use of perspective, how you make things in the foreground look bigger, and you can make a two-dimensional person rather than looking really short. Here's this crucified Christ. You actually make it look like he's lying down, and you notice much of the detail. Okay, several of the key people. Leonardo da Vinci is a true Renaissance man, someone who's an inventor and thinker and writer and painter and sculptor. A few of his more famous pieces, a self-portrait demonstrating that humanism, focusing on himself as an important subject. Sketch of Man, he was sort of a scientist as well, and demonstrating range of motion, and he tried to use circles and squares to measure different aspects of human nature. Maybe his most famous is this Mona Lisa for her enigmatic smile, half smile. That's Da Vinci. Very famous for his Last Supper as well. So you notice the religious themes don't go away, but they incorporate a bit of the Renaissance. If you compare it to some of the religiously themed art from the Middle Ages, a lot of character doesn't come out nearly the way it does in the Renaissance art. It makes the people really human. Also, they put themselves, rather than being in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, they put themselves in the Italian cityscape. Next is the artist Michelangelo, very famous for his statue of David. This is the David and Goliath from the of biblical persuasion, and the David that fought Goliath. This freestanding sculpture like this actually has an imperfection that human ankles are actually not broad enough to support the weight of the marble statue like this, and so he had to leave this extra sort of tree stump behind him to help hold the statue up. But that's just interesting fact about that. Michelangelo, very famous for the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and I apparently consistently spelled his name wrong. This is God the Father breathing life into Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Also famous for his Pietà. This is the name for any image of the Virgin Mary holding a dead crucified Christ at the foot of the cross. A famous Michelangelo. Raphael and Madonna Sistina. Before Madonna was Madonna the singer, Madonna refers to the Virgin Mary. And so there's an image of the Virgin Mary holding Christ, Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Perhaps Raphael's most famous work is the School of Athens. We talked about that classicism of the Renaissance, where they made sort of a real trend of embracing anything Greco-Roman. And so if you zoomed in images here, like we see in the middle, Plato and Aristotle, we see Socrates annoying people. Where is that? Socrates is, well, it's right over here. And a few key highlights. Here's Plato and Aristotle. Plato pointing up toward the forms, and Aristotle pointing down toward the earth. We have Socrates over here questioning, being the gadfly of Athens. Of course, these three men never actually were in the School of Athens all together. They're of different generations, but that's the beauty of the art form. He puts his hero in what many people thought was the greatest of the artists of the Renaissance, Michelangelo. He puts in the famous Greek sort of scientist, mathematician Ptolemy here, and even puts himself, he paints himself into the famous picture. Here by the Renaissance artist Donatello is a bronze David not made out of the marble, but made of a different medium, the metal bronze. This David kind of cuts a much younger, almost girlier figure with that rakish hat and the sachet to his hips, but is holding a sword. And the part of the story of David and Goliath that everyone always forgets, which is he cut Goliath's head off, and there he is standing on Goliath's head. Donatello and his St. George, Albrecht Dürer, Albrecht of the Northern Renaissance. Again, a self-portrait. He signs it, and showing that kind of humanism, right? Self-portraits are in vogue, and also demonstrating a sort of a self-importance. Many have remarked that it actually shows quite a resemblance to a Christ picture, that he sort of portrays himself as Jesus Christ in a way, which many have often remarked upon. From the Northern Renaissance, we have Peter Bruegel's Peasant Wedding. Again, we notice the humanism, and Bruegel was one of the few who actually had peasants as the theme or the subject of his art, which you didn't as much see in the Italian Renaissance. Another famous painting by Van Eyck, Jan van Eyck, Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. Several interesting characteristics here. Right above here, you can't hardly see it, but is printed, Jan van Eyck was here. And so that was his cutesy way of signing his name into his painting. Also in this mirror is himself, Jan van Eyck, painting the scene. Of course, we don't know if he actually had people pose for this or not, but in the painting, he paints a mirrored reflection of himself. Again, kind of showing that renewed humanism, self-importance. All right, that's a little bit of a overview and get you to see some examples of some Renaissance art. Well, moving on from there, let's talk about some Italian Renaissance people, including some of those that we just looked at their work. First is the Italian writer Dante, and Dante is most famous for writing the Divine Comedy. And comedy doesn't mean haha funny, comedy meaning it ends in happiness. And it's a trilogy, so if you hate trilogies, you can blame Dante for writing one of the earliest that I know of, the Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, Hell, Purgatory, Heaven. And he takes the reader on this journey through these layers of heaven down to the pits of hell, and that it's this fictional account of him being taken by an angel to visit all these parts of the afterlife. And he meets all these people who are there and learns about the particular sins that brought them there. And other than being intense cultural reference that you might be familiar with, the Divine Comedy, a lot of people mainly refer to the Inferno, the part about hell that people find most salacious and interesting and make cultural references to. But at the time, Dante was interesting because he wrote in what's called the vernacular, meaning the spoken language in his region, which was now Italian and no longer Latin. Many people, most scholars, still wrote books in Latin because, remember, it was the lingua franca. It was the universal language. People in all the countries, if they were educated and rich enough to afford a book, were able to read and speak Latin. Dante, rather, was one of the first, as early as 1320, to publish all of this in Italian rather than Latin, and is considered a groundbreaking Renaissance writer. Leonardo da Vinci, as we said, inventor, scientist, artist, genius, every possible thing you could have done. He drew diagrams of submarines. He drew diagrams of helicopters that, if they had had the proper materials to do it, they kind of could have worked. And he had lots of art. He famously sort of wrote backwards in mirror writing so that his notebooks, if they were stolen, would have limited value to other people. And just sort of a really interesting Renaissance figure. In many ways, the most truly Renaissance man among Renaissance men, meaning he did the most different areas of study and was seemingly good at them all. Michelangelo was considered among the greatest artists of all time. Other really, really talented artists considered him to be the best. He's very famous for being under the patronage of the banking family of oh, excuse me, I'm looking ahead to the Medici. He was famous for the Sistine Chapel, which we had the picture here. So there's Da Vinci's self-portrait. This is zoomed out, the Sistine Chapel. He was suspended on sort of a slab of wood that elevated him up to the ceiling, and he laid on his back inches from the ceiling, painting this whole thing over the course of, I think, a couple of years, and painted the entire chapel. They call it a chapel, but it's really more like a cathedral. It's a giant church with a vaulted ceiling, and done by Michelangelo, for which he's most famous. Okay, the Medici family, they are the banking family of the Italian city-state of Florence. And so on our map here, we can see Florence right here, kind of in north-central Italy. And they were famous and notorious as patrons and rulers. They patronized and sponsored the arts extensively, but then their family, even though there kind of were elections, they pretty much, due to their name recognition, influence, and money, tended to consolidate power. And so very famous is Cosimo de' Medici, but most famous was Lorenzo the Magnificent, so named because of the enormous amount of art that they patronized and sponsored, and made Florence in many ways the center of the Italian Renaissance, although it did take hold in many parts of northern Italy. Baldassare Castiglione, he wrote the Book of the Courtier, which defines that universal man that we spoke about earlier. Up here, we talked about those characteristics of being able to be an artist, a fighter, be socially sophisticated, and have knowledge that you could paint, draw, play instruments, be witty, polite, and well-versed in history, politics, and all sorts of things. And this was considered the standard. What does that word courtier refer to? It refers to someone who, not exactly courting a woman, but someone who is at a king's court, someone who is sophisticated and can exist and thrive in the presence of other well-bred or noble people, or even royal people. And this set the standard for that universal Renaissance man, so much so that is one of our chief characteristics of the Renaissance, is this ideal of being well-rounded and good at everything. And finally, and maybe most significantly, is Niccolo Machiavelli. He wrote a book called The Prince in 1513. In it, he gives advice to successful rulers, and he does so not because he believes that rulers should behave without moral compunction, but he looked around because all other advice on politics tended to say what a ruler ought to do, which is to be truthful and nice and kind, and that's what everyone believed was moral, and that's what books said a good ruler would do. Machiavelli looked around and said, that's all garbage. That's not who ends up being successful and powerful and well-respected and successful in war. Who finds success in politics and war, Machiavelli says? The cruel, the ruthless, people who will lie, cheat, steal, but appear to be really good. One of Machiavelli's famous questions is it safer to be feared or loved? And he says everybody wants to be loved, but it is safer to be feared. That people, when they love someone in a position of authority, they don't worry about offending them because they go, well, we have affection for each other, so if I cross him, he'll forgive me. But if you fear someone, you will not dare double-cross them because you fear them and think that their revenge will be swift. Another example of Machiavellianism is that the ends justify the means. This is the most famous quote about Machiavellianism. It means the end, or what you get in the end, justifies or makes okay the means, the method you took to get there. So doing something mean, ugly, and nasty is okay as long as you get what you get in the end. Now again, Machiavelli gets this bad reputation for telling people to be selfish and amoral people, but what he was really doing was writing about who was successful in Italian politics. And they were the least moral people tended to be the most successful in politics. And people who were honest and good and virtuous tended to get trampled on by people who didn't mind trampling on good people. That concludes our section on the Italian Renaissance. Next time, tune in for the Northern Renaissance. Thanks for watching.